Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. Well, hello. We're back to talk with another personality in accessibility, and today I'm pleased to be speaking with John Gunderson. Hello, John. How are you today?
Good. How are you doing, Joe? Thank you.
Everything's going pretty well. Where are you talking to us from?
I'm in my office at the Disability Education Center, or Rehabilitation Education Center here at the University of Illinois. So this is the building where Disability Services is housed, and also our wheelchair athletic program is also housed in this building.
Well, I think we first might have met at the CSUN conference a few years ago, possibly, but we also have a connection in that I went to college there for my degree, and definitely accessibility on campus is a lot different in terms of opportunities and facilities from when I went there. I think we were just talking about that before we started our conversation here, but yeah, maybe talk a little bit about your work at the U of I and kind of how things are set up there.
Yeah, well, maybe it would be useful to give a little bit of history of the U of I and disability. It's a unique program. Back in the late 40s, there were some students at the Galesburg VA Center who were taking classes as part of the GI program to get their college degree. And these students were actually happened to be in wheelchairs. And when they when they were shutting that program down in Galesburg and transferring students over to the U of I campus, those students in wheelchairs were told, you're not coming to the University of Illinois. I mean, how can you? You're in wheelchairs. I mean, you have a disability. Well, these guys had just fought their way across Europe and the South Pacific. Do you think they said, yeah, wow, you're right. Why didn't we think of that? No, they had a little bit different idea. So they decided to load up in cars and drive down to talk to the governor about this problem with the University of Illinois. And the governor heard they were coming, so the governor didn't really want to talk to them. So he left town too. And but there were a lot of newspaper reporters there, and they got a police escort to the Capitol steps. So there was a lot of publicity around it. And basically, at that time, kind of forced the University of Illinois taking the 20 students with disabilities on the U of I campus. And they put a man named Tim Nugent in charge of this program. And I'm not sure they knew exactly who Tim Nugent was, but I think the world, many people in the world do know now that he was basically the father of disability services and higher education, and founder of a lot of wheelchair athletic sports. So University of Illinois was a pioneer way back in the late 40s. They started the first disability services program, especially at a major university, and through the 50s and 60s, pioneered a lot of the inclusion of people with disabilities in society. Back in the 40s, wheelchairs were designed for somebody to push you around, not for you to push yourself around. There weren't any rehab hospitals to help people learn how to live independently. And so in our building, when I first got here in the 90s, there was still a kitchen here that was originally designed to help people learn how to cook and manage their life independently. So there were a lot of firsts here. Wheelchair athletics born here. One of the first Paralympic Games was held here at the University of Illinois back in the early 80s. I could go on and on about that, but the university's been a pioneer, and now not only embraces disability, lauds it as one of their major features. And there's actually a new building, one of the dorms on campus, named after Tim Nugent, which houses a special program called the Beckwith program. So Yeah, the university was originally very reluctant to take these students, and now they look at it as one of their top things, and a very inclusive university for people with disabilities.
And it has people like yourself who are charged specifically with supporting those activities. So talk a little bit about the types of things that you do on a daily basis there.
Well, a lot of my mission right now is more educational, helping people understand what accessibility means. And so, and we're also promoting universal design on campus. So the typical model in higher education is that when there's a barrier to education, you have an accommodation. So somebody does something differently or the activity is modified. But what we really want is more inclusion, that everybody has the same opportunities. So when we look at digital technology, we want to make sure that digital technology is inclusive, that people using these technologies can use their skills and abilities to interact and participate, express their knowledge and experience, just like all the other students, without having to have special accommodations or workarounds. And so universal design is one of the things we're trying to help the campus understand now, and also technology companies, for them to help support including universal design in the services or tools that they provide the university. We've all probably had a professor we really liked and probably a professor that we didn't like. And part of the reason we probably liked that professor or didn't like that professor is because they taught in a style that matched our learning abilities. And so, and a professor we didn't like probably taught in a way that maybe we didn't, learn as well. And so universal design, I think, in terms of our tooling and digital tools, I think our challenges there are, how can these tools people use to create instructional materials help take the knowledge and experience and of the professor and transform it into the different ways people can learn. And in the same way, the tools we use to assess people, especially digitally, is not unimodal, but allows students to express what they know in more than choosing the way that's best for them, and allows them to demonstrate what they actually know and understand. So I think these are some of the digital challenges we have in higher education in terms of trying to lower the barriers, reduce accommodations, and be more inclusive for people in this digital learning environment to all be on the same playing field and not have to have some people over there because the digital technology doesn't work for them for some reason.
Yeah, and I can definitely relate to my own experiences that you're talking about learning styles with some of my professors that didn't work out as well. But now, as I teach at the University of Washington, I've done that for many years, and I still have to challenge myself all the time to be attentive to providing an inclusive lesson plan and thinking about different learning styles. So so I can totally appreciate that. One of the things that I like to do on this series of interviews is talk with people about how they where they started, how they came around to accessibility, because I've found that we've all had different, sometimes very circuitous paths to getting to this kind of work. So maybe talk a little bit about, kind of what you first were involved with professionally and what got you to where you're at today.
Well, I first got involved with disability and technology as an undergraduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I was an electrical engineering student, and we had a project course with microprocessors, and there was an early research center on technology and disability called the Trace Center at the University of Wisconsin, led by Dr. Greg Vanderheiden, who's now at University of Maryland. But we had a project to build a communication device for somebody who's non-speaking. And our class, we were trying to build a portable voice, a speech synthesizer. So back then, speech synthesis is pretty ubiquitous right now, but back in the late 70s, there weren't too many speech synthesizers in general, and even less that could run on a battery, that this communication device. So our job was to patch together some software we got actually from the University of Illinois, and a TSR phoneme synthesizer and a microprocessor board to make a synthesizer that could hopefully be understandable. But that project didn't get too far, but it kind of got me interested in technology and disability. So I went back to talk to Dr. Vanderheiden after that class and had some independent studies as an undergraduate, and then eventually did some graduate work in electrical engineering, building some technology, a pointing device for somebody who could only point with their head. They couldn't use their hands to access a computer system, and a Trine system, which was a communication technology that was designed to, on some of the early portable computers. This was a Epson HX80, which had like a 40 line by 40 by 4, basically 160 character screen, but it had a little printer, and you could attach at that time a little speech synthesizer to it, built by a company. And I also got involved with computer access, building some early computer access prototypes of things we see now in computers. We see like sticky keys and mouse keys. We built some prototypes or some early versions of that, or I was involved with some of that. And eventually worked on my PhD in looking at recognition of synthesized speech by people who are blind. And then I came to the University of Illinois after I graduated from Wisconsin as part of a rehab engineering training grant to train rehabilitation engineers for 3 years. And then at that time, Brad Hedrick became the director of DRES. And there was this thing called the Mosaic browser that was popular at the university. And he had the foresight to say, this internet stuff and this computer stuff is going to be a big thing for people with disabilities. So he created a position for me to continue working here at the University of Illinois in disability services to look at how we can make sure that this technology is accessible to our students with disabilities, and to provide leadership in making sure that these technologies are accessible. And I got involved with the W3C at that time and have been involved with different working groups. I chaired the user agent accessibility guidelines working group to version 1.0. And then I've been involved with the ARIA working group since its inception. When Rich Schwarzfeger from IBM came up with the idea, I said, this is what we need. And I wanted to support that. And 20 years later, ARIA is, it's come a long way, but I think it's still very misunderstood and has some gaps in it. So I continue to participate, especially in the ARIA authoring practices working group, helping to build examples and guidance on how to actually use this stuff to create accessible experiences for people with disabilities.
Well, before we go on, I think this is a good area to dive into a little bit more deeper because I was fortunate to have the opportunity to work on an accessibility working group early on with the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and there may be many people listening to this that aren't aware of of the impact that the Web Accessibility Initiative from the W3C has had, on the development of the standards that have helped so many, and we still certainly have a lot of work to do. But maybe could you dig in a little bit more to the explaining what the ARIA work is all about? I think it's probably something that people in this field that you may be familiar with, but there's probably also a lot who are coming in new that may not be familiar with that acronym, or what it is able to accomplish.
Okay, yeah, so ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Application Specification. And probably, you're right, the W3C Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is probably what everybody thinks about when they think of accessibility at the W3C. But it's important to understand that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, tells developers what people with disabilities need. It doesn't necessarily tell them how to get it done. And the techniques document, while there's been a lot of work on it, doesn't always identify the best practices, and there's also many gaps in helping people understand what that particular feature needs. So what the ARIA working group is a technical specification. When Rich Schwarzfeger in the early part of the web, he was at IBM, seeing these new web applications being developed with JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. He recognized that there was no way to describe these new widgets to people using assistive technologies or screen readers. And so he devised this system called ARIA, which allows developers to describe how these features that aren't part of standard HTML. So like in HTML, there's a button element. So there's in ARIA, so buttons are pretty predictable. You can, when the screen reader goes to the button, it tells you what it is. It's a button. The button has a label, and it can describe it. And there's a special tag in HTML for button. But some developers are very creative, and they say, I don't want to use the button element. I want to use a div element, and I'll put a bunch of them. I'll put an event handler on it, and it'll act just like a button. But when a screen reader gets to that div element, it has no idea there's a button on there. And if it's not part of the tab order of the page, which it probably isn't, they'll go right by it. They won't even know that that button exists. So what ARIA does is provides a vocabulary to describe that div element as a button. So you can put roll button on that div. And now people know, okay, it's a button element. And the developer then has to know what the features are of the button. So if it's a button element, not only are you able to click on it, but you're also going to have to put keyboard event handlers on it, so that if I press space or enter, it will activate that button functionality just like it was a regular button. So it requires developers to do two things. They have to know, they have to understand the vocabulary ARIA and how it describes something, and then they have to make sure that those behaviors associated with that description are also part of the web page. I think one of the problems we see with ARIA is that when developers or designers go to the ARIA specification, it's like Candyland to them. Boy, look at all these things, menus, tabs, I've got all this stuff on my web page. And so they think sprinkling this stuff around their web page actually is somehow making it more accessible, because they're trying to use that vocabulary. They're trying to use that vocabulary in their understanding of what it means, not in how ARIA is understanding. And actually doing that actually makes the page less accessible. In fact, the number one rule of the authoring practices is no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. So people really need to understand what the ARIA is doing, what other features that are needed to support ARIA. Just sprinkling roles and properties and states around on a page doesn't make it accessible unless the associated behaviors and other features that are needed for keyboard support especially. In fact, when I talk to people about ARIA, the first thing I ask is, how does somebody interact with that with the keyboard? And then I'll tell you which ARIA roles are associated with that keyboard interaction. Whereas most people think, well, I have a menu, so I'll put the menu thing in there. And they don't look at the other part of it. Well, what does the keyboard interaction for a menu consist of? And that just, there's a good video called the Viking and the lumberjack, and they talk about accessibility. And it's like, you open up the door thinking you're going to go into the bathroom, but you step into a pool. It's a great visual of this, that, you're telling people one thing, but it's really something else because the behaviors aren't what the role is describing. So,
well, yeah, this is one of those areas related to accessibility, design and development that I think is, people coming in new to the area, things can seem overwhelming. And I know in our organization, I try to break it down so that practitioners can understand how accessibility fits into their own roles. And so, for example, with our interaction designers, I try to explain that there's accessibility issues to consider for things like your button example in terms of what the interactions are for that, and then have that as part of the design specification, so that when it gets to the developer, then they can be thinking about the actual execution without having to act in the role of the designer, and that kind of helps everybody go to their own strengths.
yeah, well, it certainly requires everybody to understand their part of the puzzle, and including this information in the design phase is a huge benefit for accessibility. Unfortunately, a lot of accessibility work is done when the product is almost complete, when somebody says, oh, let's go hire a third-party company to tell us what we need to do to fix the accessibility. And they get the report back and they're shipping in 1 week or 2 weeks or whatever. Mm-hmm. And there's just cosmetic changes to improve accessibility, unfortunately. But that's the way to do it. Having your designers, developers, and your QA people also testing for these features. That's wonderful.
Yeah, getting involved as early as possible is always more efficient, less costly than trying to do remediation at the end. And you really can only have innovation, to really get toward that universal design. You really have to be thinking from the start, about all of your potential audience for a particular digital product.
Yeah, I think especially when you look at the design phase, it really helps people understand what are we truly trying to accomplish here, and makes the experience better for everybody. Just like curb cuts are more than just for people in wheelchairs these days. They help other people, older people who might not be able to walk as well, delivery people in pushing baby carriages, or people on bikes, going up on the sidewalk. So when people build these things in at the beginning of the process, it's definitely a big plus, not only for the people with disabilities, but usually the design decisions help everybody.
Well, as we kind of circle back to where we're at today, I thought maybe one last thing we could talk about are some of the things that you're currently involved in, with your work at the university. Are there any particular project work that you want to share, or new techniques or developments that are going on there?
Well, probably the biggest thing we've been working on that people might be interested in is something called the Skip2 project. So probably some of the people, if you're familiar with accessibility, are familiar with the old skip to main link, the top of a page. Typically, if you use the keyboard, you tab onto a page, a little thing appears saying, skip to main. You hit enter, it moves keyboard focus to main. And that's been around in various forms for over 20 years. It hasn't really changed that much. But the web has changed quite a bit in the last 20 years. So I consider it kind of an antiquated technique. So this project we're working on is called Skip2JS, and it builds upon a lot of the ARIA work and also the heading structure of a page. And by adding the script to a page, it will basically build a dynamic menu using the ARIA menu button pattern to show some of the important landmarks and headings on the page And so people can not only navigate to the main landmark, but they can also go to different headings on the page, or they could go to one of the navigation regions on the page. And just like I mentioned before, this now also provides an outline for everybody on the page. So we encourage people to actually have this link visible at all time. It's called Skip to Content at the top of the page. Anybody can click on it and they immediately have a high-level overview of the content on that page without having to scroll through the page. We've taken that one step further. Nick Hoyt here, one of our interaction designers and developers, has built a Chrome and Firefox extension that builds this right into the browser. You don't have to have it on your web page, which now gives the ability of people, keyboard-only users, to access this heading and landmark structure that's typically only available to screen reader users. So that's one of the projects that we're recently working on. I'd be happy to share a link to that if you're interested. So,
all right. Yeah, great. Yeah, well, I'll get that link from you and I'll add that into the notes for this presentation. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me about your current work and a little bit about your background, and hopefully, you know, sometime soon we'll be back to events where we'll be comfortable and safe with meeting physically again. And I'll be able to see you at one or the other of the many accessibility events.
yeah, great. Well, thank you, Joe. And thank you to everybody who's taken the time to listen to this podcast or this presentation.
All right, well, thanks a lot, John. We'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.